Hello, everybody. Come on in. I'm so happy to see you here. I'm just so grateful to have you here. And I am just so happy that I managed to persuade Ben to take the mic today again. I'm assuming that you are too. Tell us in the chat box so that it's easier for me next time to tell Ben that he should be on here, because it takes a while in between. All right, excellent. So I'm just going to get us started right away, Ben, because there's a lot to be said today. So good that you guys are finding the chat box. Great, keep comments going there. And as you know, that's where we go for questions and comments as the seminar goes too. So very, very welcome to the webinar today. My name is Hannah Norberg, and I am one of the co-creators of the TPRF Forum together with with Ben Shepherd. So we started this. Oh, is this our 2-year anniversary? I think it is.
It is. Yeah, you're right.
I think it is because we started this right at Halloween 2 years ago. And so we must have had, 25 or something webinars for those who want to count. It's all right to just head on over to the website because we record them. And so that's also good to know that this is recorded. So everything that happens, thank you, Julia. Everything that happens is recorded and will then go on YouTube. So in case that you don't want to be on that, now is the time to get off. So very, very welcome to the TPRF Forum that we started, as I said, 2 years ago. And with the logo that not only Ben got to pick because he's Australian and it looks like a bridge, but Maria and we could have picked it as the Öresund Bridge, right, Maria? We could have done that if we wanted to. But the idea is actually to bridge the gap, between policymakers and researchers, to bridge the gap between different disciplines of research, to bridge the gap between all over the world. So the geographic gap and the career gap and the generational gap and any other gap you can think of. It's just basically what we do as we can say Trade Policy Research Forum. So what we do is that we run a webinar. For now is what we're doing, run a webinar about once a month. And then sometimes Jeffrey comes on and does an extra one on careers. And we have an amazing team that are helping us out. So we have Raibul, who does the posters, and Jeffrey is also helping out with seminars, as is Sylvia Soresco. And we have an amazing advisory team. So go ahead and check that out on the website. We are on Twitter, we are on LinkedIn, and we are on the website. So if you are not yet signed up, and you can sign up also to not miss these, right? Ben, that's true too, right?
Yep. So the mailing list sign up is on the website as well.
Cool. So there are many ways to connect with us. And so without further ado, unless I missed anything, Ben, did I?
No, that sounds all good. So if people want to post questions in the chat box or in the Q&A, we will look forward to dealing with all of that in the Q&A session at the end.
All right, and then we have a special guest today, also Maria Persson from my alma mater, who is and it's 10 minutes from my house, so I'm actually going to take her out to lunch because of her troubles, and you can hold me to it. Usually it's easy for us to, hey, Oslo, to say that and then not follow up, but this time I'm going to have to do it, and you can check in next time that I've actually done it. But I really look forward to today, Maria, and I'm really looking forward to that lunch. Yes. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Ben, and I'm going to mute myself so that there's a more stable connection. So go ahead.
Okay, thanks a lot, Hannah. And it's great to see everyone here. You should hopefully have my slides up on the screen. I'm really happy to have Maria with us because trade facilitation is such a small community around the world, people doing research. There's a lot of people doing it in practice, but not that many people researching it. So to have a real expert here to comment on the presentation is a great pleasure for me. Now, of course, I've built this up to say everything you ever wanted to know about trade facilitation and value chains. The everything you ever wanted to know part is an invitation to Q&A. So any questions that you have, please post them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll try and give you some sort of response. But what I want to do today is talk about a paper that I published recently in World Economy that uses a global trade model to look at the links between GVC trade and trade facilitation. So, the first question, which, I don't think I need to answer in any great depth, is kind of why should we care about GVCs, right? Everyone kind of talks about them, but why do we care about them? Now, if I was doing one of the kind of 100 presentations that I've done on this before, I'd put up a picture of the iPhone and I'd show you the iPhone supply chain and where all of the component parts come from. But I decided to mix it up a bit and talk about a different product, which is one that gets talked about a little less. This is Nutella. For those who aren't familiar with it, it is a delicious hazelnut spread that is sort of pretty common in Europe and North America. I'm not sure how common it is in the rest of the world. But the reason for using it is to say that GVCs are not just about high-end electronics. They're also about primary goods sectors like agricultural products and food and beverage. So Nutella originally comes from Italy, but when I consume it here in the United States, it's imported either from Mexico or Canada. But of course, that doesn't mean that the whole number of ingredients that go into this delicious spread actually come from Mexico and Canada. And you can see here on the map all of the locations around the world that draw some inputs that then go into this Nutella that I consume. Regular trade data are going to tell me that I import the full value of the Nutella from either Mexico or Canada. But regular trade data aren't telling the full story because they're missing all the trade that takes place in these input markets. And that's what I'm particularly interested in this paper, is modeling all of these different sorts of linkages and trying to do a better job of capturing some of this value chain trade. So the way that I like to think of a GVC is as this sort of infinite chain of input-output relationships. Now, when I say infinite chain, people who've worked with the math behind input-output tables immediately know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a use of what's called the Leontief inverse, but I promised not to do any equations in this talk. So I'm not going to go through kind of how we formalize this, this insight. But basically, the idea that I've got is that you've got kind of a final product like my Nutella, and then you've got a set of direct inputs, that is to say the stuff that the final goods producer buys and puts together in order to produce the final good. Then each of those input suppliers themselves has inputs that they purchase, and those guys have inputs that they purchase, and so on and so forth, all the way through the economy. And we can do that through an infinite number of steps because every input supplier is buying stuff from other people. So the essence of a GVC and where the G comes into it is that this process is not only spread out across sectors, that is to say that each input is coming from a particular economic part of the economy, a particular sector, it's also coming from a particular country. So there's a geographical aspect to the way in which this activity spreads. And so that enables us to divide up the final product into some different components. You'll see that I've labeled here the boxes in blue and red. It's the same diagram. So I've got these direct inputs, then the indirect inputs, and then the dots indicating that it goes all the way down this infinitely long chain. But I'm saying that, let's imagine that we can group everything together so that all of the blue boxes originate in the country of final consumption. That is to say that they're domestic value added. That is to say that the value added is coming from businesses located in the same country as the export country. Then we've got red boxes for inputs that originate in other countries, what we're going to call foreign value added. So if you think of a company that is importing its intermediate goods and services, those are going into the red category. And that's happening then all the way back through the value chain. So we're summing up not just the direct use of imported intermediates, but also all of the indirect uses. That is to say, the uses of inputs by the producers of my inputs, and so on and so forth, all the way down the chain. So you can do some really annoying math with all of this. And there are some papers out there that take great pains to figure out how exactly we can get from standard trade statistics, which just measure the gross value of exports, that is to say the price that is written on the invoice, to this kind of value-added appreciation of trade. The version that I used, for people in the know, it's the WWZ decomposition, so Wang, Wei, and Zhu from 2014. It divides the value of gross exports up into three components. So domestic value added, that is to say value added that originates in the country of export. Foreign value added, that is to say value added that originates in other countries. And pure double counting, that is to say the trade that we get because stuff is going backwards and forwards across borders multiple times during the production process. So it turns out that there's a fully consistent way in which to take trade data and national accounts data, so specifically an input-output table, and to break down the invoice value of trade into these three components. And so this is a tool that I'm going to be using all the way through the presentation and indeed in the model that I use to look at GVC trade. So once we've got the decomposition, we can kind of say what we think GVC trade constitutes within that categorization into three broad categories. I should say those are the broad categories. If you look at the paper, there's also a whole bunch of subcategories that go into each of those, but we don't really need to care about those subcategories at the moment. So what I've got here on the left-hand side is what I'm calling GVC trade, which is the sum of foreign value added and pure double counting as a percentage of exports. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that if the value of what you're exporting is made up either of stuff that is moving backwards and forwards multiple times, so it's being counted more than once in trade statistics, or you're using directly or indirectly imported intermediate goods and services, then what you're doing sounds something like a GVC. And so we can count that as GVC trade. And you can see here, I've got figures going through from 2000 to 2019 with a bit of a gap in the early years. This is coming from the Asian Development Bank's multi-region input-output table. But basically what you can see is there's a strong increase in GVC trade in the early 2000s. Then it kind of levels off. And then it sort of jumps again around 2015 and kind of levels off again at a higher level after that. So, you know, two things to note from the graph. One is that we do see these changes over time, but the second thing is that the changes are relatively modest compared to the amount that we talk about GVC trade in the policy literature. So definitely we're talking about a significant part of world trade, but the changes that we're seeing over time are relatively modest. So the question that I have, and the question that I'm trying to answer in the paper, is what is driving these changes? And I look at one factor in particular. Let's think for a second about the sorts of factors that might have an impact on the way in which gross exports get split up into these three different components: domestic value added, foreign value added, and pure double counting. Now, what I've done here on the left-hand side is the world's simplest flowchart that summarizes the way in which I think about this. So when you have a change in trade costs, and that is to say a change in trade costs, particularly affecting intermediate goods sectors, then the split that you get between what a company sources locally, that is to say in its own country, what it sources overseas, and how it organizes its production process, that is to say what is zipping back and forth multiple times, that all changes, okay? And it changes because trade costs change the relative price of each of these different types of sourcing. So there's a cost-benefit calculation that goes on. But basically, we can start with something that we can conceptualize and measure pretty easily, that is to say a change in trade costs. And then hopefully with a bit of magic, we can add an intermediate step into the analysis that we would normally make between a change in trade costs and a change in gross trade value, to add this middle part about the composition of trade between domestic and foreign value added and pure double counting. So the choice that a given producer is making in this case of where do I source my goods changes when there's a change in trade costs. Now, I'm going to be interested in one source in particular of changes in trade costs, and that's improvements in trade facilitation. Now, why am I interested in this? In part, I'm interested in it because I'm a trade facilitation guy. I spend a lot of my time working on trade facilitation. So in my world, my little epistemic community, people suspect that trade facilitation is one pretty good way of promoting GVC trade. But the quantitative evidence is not as strong as you might think. So I want to add to that and try and build up the evidence base and, of course, see whether or not the conjecture is actually true. But the second reason for looking at trade facilitation in particular is that in particular in the markets in high-income countries, tariffs are no longer the binding constraint on market entry. So they've come down a great deal over time historically. It's very true in the high-income countries. It's also pretty true in most low and middle-income countries that we no longer see the very, very high tariff rates that we were used to decades ago. So the binding constraint is non-tariff measures, and that includes things like trade facilitation. Now, what do I mean in this context by trade facilitation? There are many different definitions that the term gets. The one that I'm taking is really following the WTO trade facilitation agreement. And I'm saying that it's got something to do with the efficiency of customs and border procedures. So there are other ways that I could look at it. I think this one is neat, both because it has a really good policy interpretation in terms of the WTO trade facilitation agreement, but also because it is very well measured. So we have a set of trade facilitation indicators from the OECD that glue together very well with the concept of trade facilitation in the TFA. So the TFA, of course, entered into force in 2017, but it wasn't kind of what I would call a big bang in terms of trade facilitation, in the sense that it was really crystallizing what a lot of countries had been doing over time before that. So hopefully it accelerates the process a little bit, but it's not starting something brand new that people weren't doing before. Of course, one thing we have to be careful of is the staged implementation framework of the TFA. So for low and middle income countries, called developing countries at the WTO and LDCs, they are able to select which bits of the agreement they want to implement on which timetable. So we don't see the entire agreement being implemented as of 2017, except in the high income countries. What we see elsewhere is progressive changes over time. Now, on the left-hand side, I've just done a simple correlation between the change in the OECD index of trade facilitation regulation on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis, the change in GVC integration in the way that I've described it, that is to say, foreign value added plus pure double counting as a proportion of exports. And you can see that there's a positive association. It doesn't look sort of incredibly strong when you just do this scatter plot, but that's why we need to go into it in more detail to see what role other variables might be playing. And in particular, something that we'd like to do is to really quantify the link and to say how much of the observed changes in GVC participation over time can we actually link back to improvements in trade facilitation. So what I do to try and answer that question is to produce a formal model. Now, I'm not going to go through the model except with a flowchart that I've got on the next slide. The model itself is not straightforward. When I say it's not straightforward, that doesn't mean that the thinking behind it is very hard. It really satisfies the criteria that you find in any general equilibrium model of global trade. What's challenging, of course, is turning that into a system of equations. So we're talking about a lot of computer code, a lot of programming time, and of course, some fantastic contributions by theorists that I draw on in being able to put the model together. But what I do is really two things. First, I run a structural gravity model to provide an estimate of the elasticity of bilateral trade with respect to trade facilitation. Then I plug those estimates looking at changes between 2015 and 2019 into what's called a new quantitative trade model. It's a computational model that has the exact same structural gravity model governing the relationship of bilateral trade between countries, but it's got a lot else besides. It's got a production structure, it's got a consumption structure, and all the typical general equilibrium bells and whistles. So the question I'm interested in answering is, given the changes that we've observed in GVC participation over countries in the 2015 to 2019 period, what proportion can the model reproduce using only the observed changes in trade facilitation as an input? And that'll give us an idea of how significant trade facilitation has been in producing these observed outcomes. Like I said, I can summarize the model in this flowchart. The right-hand side you've seen before. It's really just a cutout of something that's going on in the middle of the model, saying that when we've got a change in trade costs, it reallocates the way in which companies engage in sourcing decisions, which in turn changes the composition of gross trade. But basically what the model does is that it starts off with a policy change, and it turns that into a particular form that the model can deal with, and the form is an ad valorem equivalent. And it then looks at how the policy change translates into changes in trade costs. On the one hand, for final goods, and on the other hand, for intermediate goods and services. And then we get kind of this double whammy effect. So the change in trade costs changes prices directly for consumers. And then there's also a secondary effect where it changes production costs. And that then feeds through again into prices for consumers. Now, once we've got those changes in prices, we can compute changes in the terms of trade, that is to say the price of exports in terms of imports, and we can turn it into changes in the volume of trade, that is to say the amount, the value of trade that's taking place and the composition of that trade across countries and across sectors. Then adding those two effects together gives us a macroeconomic outcome, that is to say the change in real gross national income. So that's a very simple flowchart. For people interested in the model, the paper is called Caliendo and Paro, 2015, and the particular variant of it that I'm using is very close to a paper by Eichler and Hyland in 2018 in the Journal of International Economics. So let me give you a sense of the sort of results that come out of the model. As you can imagine, there's a ton of results. And so I'm going to be very, very selective in what I present. I want you to take away two things. The first is the left-hand panel, which is coming out of the econometric part of the analysis, that is to say, the structural gravity model. What it's showing is the distribution of changes in trade costs. So these are box plots, and it's the standard box plot. So a dot means an outlier, then the lines tell you the interquartile range, the horizontal line is the median, et cetera, et cetera. So what I want you to take away is that the changes in trade costs that we've seen as a result of changes in trade facilitation are generally pretty small. We're talking about just a few percentage points. So like I said at the beginning, when the TFA was implemented, we didn't see this kind of big bang where everyone suddenly started undertaking their border processes completely differently. We saw a crystallization of a process that had been underway for some time, and we saw progressive improvement rather than radical change. You should also note that there are some values of these changes that lie above 1. That is to say that some countries have gotten a little bit worse over time. That's obviously something that we don't want to see, but it comes out of the OECD data. It's not a huge number of countries, but it is there and it's worth noting. The second thing that's worth noting, which was surprising to me, is that the impact of trade facilitation is generally bigger on consumer goods, that is to say goods going into final consumption rather than intermediates. That surprised me because I thought exactly the opposite. And I think most people in our world have thought exactly the opposite. So there is an impact on intermediate trade, but it is somewhat less than I would have expected. So the right-hand panel shows you what happens at the end point of the model. That is to say, after these inputs go through all of the stages in the flowchart, And basically what it's showing you is the percentage of observed variation in GVC integration measured as I described it, that is accounted for by the counterfactual in the model. So basically, how much are we explaining using only this change in trade facilitation performance? And you can see that we do a pretty reasonable job. It gets up as high as 60% in one sector. More typically, it's in the region of 30 to 40%. When I calculate the global average, it's about 30%. So what I take away from this is that even small changes in trade facilitation, that is to say, relatively minor improvements in the sense of changes in trade costs, can actually translate into a significant proportion of additional GVC trade. That is to say, even though the change is slow over time, about a third of what we saw globally was accounted for by just this one policy area. Then, of course, we've got tariffs and all these other things, regional trade agreements on top of it, that are accounting for the rest. So if I were to summarize my findings, I'd say that the changes in trade costs are relatively modest, and I think probably more modest than many in the area would expect. But notwithstanding that, they still had a pretty significant impact, not only on aggregate trade, but on the composition of trade between GVC trade and what I would call the sort of standard business to consumer trade transaction. Now, there's a lot of variation in the results that I haven't really gone into. We can go into it in Q&A if there's demand. But the sources of variation are twofold. One is that there's a set of sectoral characteristics that the model captures. So some sectors are more responsive to these sorts of changes than others. Then the second is an econometric aspect, that when we run the estimation, we find that the link between trade flows and trade facilitation is tighter in some sectors than in others. So as always at TPRF, we try to present a paper pretty quickly and schematically and sort of go to the policy results at the end. So let me wrap up by saying four things. The first is that, this is a modeling paper. So part of what I want to do in the paper is to demonstrate that this class of model called new quantitative trade models really have some important advantages for the ways in which we think about trade policy changes and their outcomes. To my mind, they bring together the very best of econometric gravity modeling and what we've been used to from historical CGE models. So they're kind of an update of both of those areas. We get the empirical fit and the simplicity of gravity, but we get a lot of parsimony and transparency relative to models like GTAP, which people may be familiar with. The second point is that GVC trade is relatively sensitive to changes in trade costs, in particular with this reshuffling of sourcing that takes place in input markets. So the policy result is that lowering these costs, and in particular focusing on lowering the costs related to input transactions, can help promote production sharing across borders. The third point is that trade facilitation is one set of policies that's helped do that over time, not in a radical way, but in a sense of kind of progressive change over a period of years. So it's helped GVC trade grow. But having said that, and this is the fourth point, like I said, the TFA has this kind of phased implementation approach for developing countries where they get to pick and choose which parts of the agreement they want to participate in. And of course, the argument of my paper, and I think the empirical results suggest that there's good reason to try and be as wholesome and as fulsome as possible in terms of taking on TFA obligations. Some of them are technically challenging. Some of them require upfront investment, which means that there needs to be external financing. But in the end, they can bring great benefits, not only in terms of increasing the amount of trade that a country engages in, but changing the type of trade. That is to say, moving from the historical business to consumer type trade to GVC trade, where we're focusing more heavily on movements in intermediate goods and services. Like I said at the beginning, trade facilitation is a small world, so I'm very happy to have someone with a lot of expertise to comment on the paper. That's it from me, and I'll hand back to Hannah and Maria.
Thank you, Ben. That was exceptional. it seems like you have done this before and that you have been in this sort of webinars before. I'm loving that last slide, which was so many takeaways. Just a quick question before I hand over to Maria. So those who might be in the webinar today that don't really know what trade facilitation is and exactly what parts that you have modeled, so that they can you just give sort of.
Sure. So what I'm talking about is improvements in customs and border procedures. So examples of trade facilitation that come out of the WTO agreement are things like moving to an electronic single window. That is to say, having an online system where you submit your documentation once, and then the documentation gets moved automatically to all of the agencies that need to see it. It means things about transit, for example, making use of documentation that makes it easier for trucks in particular to move across borders, to move through countries when they're going to a landlocked country in the interior. It means publishing information about trade-related rules and policies, all this sort of thing. So for anyone who's interested in more, the WTO has a great explainer on the trade facilitation agreement. And I'd really recommend that because it gives you a kind of blow-by-blow description of all of the things that are actually in the agreement. And of course, it makes clear what is not in the agreement as well.
I think that's fascinating. And I also like to point out sort of how it works, because if you're looking at tariffs, then you might be looking at that sort of before you start exporting, right? So you might think of, if I have to pay this much, will there still be a profit? But these examples are mostly things that you understand as you're doing it, as you're moving things through customs, right? So it's a more practical and sort of hands-on experience than so that's really interesting. Well, I'm super psyched to hear what Maria has to say about this.
Thank you. Such a great pleasure to be here today. It was such a great pleasure to read this nice paper by Ben. So let me see if I can share my screen as well. Being an economist, I obviously have slides.
Works well.
It works now? Good.
Yep.
All right. So let me start by saying I really like this paper. What it does, of course, it offers us a framework for understanding and for analyzing the link between, on the one hand, trade costs, and the other hand, global value chains. And this is, I really like this because global value chains, I think most of us know that they're very important, but from a research perspective, they're actually quite poorly understood. And I think that this framework can help us get to the bottom of a lot of things that we still don't fully understand. So that's very good. I also want to especially commend Ben for reading this paper, how very carefully he explains and motivates the framework. I've read papers in this general realm of things. This is unusual, but it's incredibly helpful. So kudos for really making the effort to make this accessible. Also, of course, there's an interesting application then of this framework where we find some both policy relevant and quite informative results specifically on trade facilitation. And Ben is able to offer us plausible evidence that, yes, changes in trade facilitation is actually one of the drivers between changes in trade in global value chains. So this is an important result. So this is a really nice paper. It has real value. So I'm not going to sit here as a classical discussant and sort of try to find problems or mistakes. What I'm going to do is to, based on this paper, try to offer a few areas where I think that, research as we move on could be particularly fruitful. So I'm going to raise 4 issues. And the first one is a little bit technical, and this is something that Ben himself actually raises in the paper, so I'm not going to go through this a lot, but what the paper does is, in a technical sense, it models something that's called iceberg trade costs. And this is absolutely fine. This is best practice. This is what people do. But for those who are sort of interested in the technical aspects of this, how we model these variable trade costs, if it is as a so-called iceberg trade cost, where we essentially think that a part of the value of the shipment will melt away when going from one country to another, or if we model as at per unit variable trade cost. It can actually alter the results, both in terms of the magnitude of the result and potentially also through which mechanisms that trade is affected. So this is one thing that it'll be interesting to see whether Ben or others will build on in future work. Now, this is variable trade costs, but what about fixed costs? So one nice thing that heterogeneous firm trade theory, those are the theories that we work a lot on with in trade these days, they remind us that both variable and fixed trade costs matter for trade. Now, it's absolutely the case that a lot of the trade facilitation related costs are variable, like those that Ben looked at in this paper. But it's also the case that a lot of the costs that are related to trade facilitation are probably fixed as well. So just to try to give you an image, if we have a very complicated documentation system, there's a lot of paperwork you need to hand in order to be able to export a good, say, then just reading up on this, understanding how the system works is going to be a big fixed cost for the firm. And you have to get through that in order to even start trading. But once you've done that, you can probably trade a lot because you already know this stuff. I would say generally, this is not a dig on this paper. Generally, the literature on trade facilitation doesn't really take this distinction seriously. But it seems to me that if we really want to understand the mechanisms through which trade facilitation affects trade, it's possible that this distinction matters. And we should probably think about this distinction more. A third point I want to make has to do with heterogeneous trade facilitation environment. So what do I mean by this? So what Ben does in this paper, which is really nice, is that he's allowing different effects from trade facilitation on different sectors. So he's allowing for a lot of heterogeneity here. Some sectors are more affected by these costs than others. But what if the trade facilitation environment itself isn't the same across all products and across all trade partners? Right? So what Ben uses is OECD data on trade facilitation performance. And this is country specific and it varies over time. So essentially we have one measure per country and year. And this is absolutely fine. This is what the good papers do. But if I think again ahead of what would we like to continue doing, it is possible that taking into account the heterogeneity in the trade facilitation environment itself within a single country could be important. So just to sort of motivate this point, we do have access to some microdata now. I have one paper here, for instance, a working paper from last year. It's very nice. That offers some evidence that the chance that an individual shipment is actually going to be either sent to the green lane at customs where you're more or less waved through, or it'll be sent through the red lane where you have to show all your paperwork. You have to go through inspections. This will depend on stuff like what exactly is the product that's being traded? Do we have SPS measures that apply, for instance? Sanitary and phytosanitary measures. What's the country of origin? How was it transported? What's the identity of the exporting firm and the importing firm, etc.? So essentially, there's a lot of heterogeneity, and it is possible that focusing on this heterogeneity could be important. It could help us understand, again, the link between trade facilitation and trade changes better. Final point I want to make, which is, it's so nice because I think this is the final point that Ben was making as well, right? There's more to do in the area of trade facilitation. So linking back to that comment, what I would like to see research on as well is, okay, so what's the lowest hanging fruit here? Most of us in the research community, we're sort of pretty abstract. We talk about changes in trade facilitation. But if I'm a policymaker, I'm a practitioner, I need to decide what should I do first? Where can I get the most bang for my buck? So, you know, linking again to global value chains, if I want to integrate into global value chains more, how can I do that best? What's the first thing I should do with limited resources? And here's the problem. I think that practitioners have a lot of knowledge about what is being done on the ground, but they're not trained in doing rigorous, sort of scientifically sound studies that can help us understand the causal link between reforms and outcomes. Researchers like me and Ben, we are trained to do that, but we don't have this institutional knowledge that practitioners do. So what I think is that, well, it would be really nice if researchers and practitioners could kind of team up and do really good studies on this. And that's something, so I'm just throwing this out there. If anyone is interested in discussing that, I'm sure that both me and Ben would be fascinated by such a prospect. So to sum up here, it was a pleasure reading this paper. It's an excellent paper, well worth your time. But there are also more studies like this that are needed to close gaps in the research literature. So thank you. That was all that I wanted to say for now.
Thank you, Maria. As when Ben told me he had gotten Maria to do this seminar, I was like, she is the most educational speaker I've ever heard. And it's true, and I could just go on and listen all day long. I wasn't even, I'm usually very strict on time, but I wasn't even looking at the time, and that was fine. But really great, Maya, as always. And I, again, love your last slide, because it's exactly what we want to do here. You know, having exactly, there's research here, and these are the things that people could look at quickly if they wanted to do something. And also, this is what policymakers could look at. So if you could teach all the speakers that we have to do that, that would be great, Maria. We can cut on you to do that. That is perfect, right, Ben?
Absolutely.
And I was just thinking about, also for policymakers, the fixed versus variable costs are really important. It's an important thing to think about when we're talking about SMEs, for example, because they might be able to swing the variable cost, but not the fixed cost, to me, right? And then the heterogeneous trade facilitation in, you know, on country specific versus industrial. It's very much real. I've been working with customs, and it was the red and green was exactly what they were talking about there. It's also something really interesting to do. People can reach out to you on LinkedIn and continue the conversation.
Absolutely, be happy to continue.
Excellent. Well, just to state that there, because before we just release all the questions here, so nobody gets FOMO, we can follow up and we can continue the conversation, because there's about 1,000 people in the group, right, Ben? In the LinkedIn group. So that's a perfect place to start. Now, questions have been rolling in and are still coming in. I know this is Ben's superpower, so I'm actually going to hand it to Ben to sort of get through this.
Yeah, no, happy to. You know, firstly, Maria, thank you so much for those comments. You know, when we started TPRF, we sort of said, you know, we want to recreate something a bit like a brown bag seminar, but without the nasty stuff. And so what you have done is absolutely perfect, because, you know, to me, the litmus test of great comments is that you walk away with more research ideas than you had when you started. And so that's definitely the case for me. So I actually feel re-energized to go back to some of this and think about, you know, how it can be extended, how we can look at different things. And you know, I think that's, you know, really useful both to me and I think to everyone in the audience as well. Let me just respond on a couple of points. I'm going to pull out two of the points that you mentioned. You know, one is the use of microdata. You know, I agree with you. I love those papers that the guys at IADB have been doing using microdata. I mean, they have a series of them. And I think that's the way forward in terms of sort of estimating at a really detailed level the sorts of policies that matter most. And I agree with you completely. We don't yet have a clear sense of that. The OECD database, as you know, has all these different pillars. I simply aggregated them into, kind of one overall pillar. So it doesn't enable me to then drill down and say, well, having an electronic single window matters more than having an authorized economic operator scheme. But you're right, that's what practitioners and policymakers need to know. So I think figuring out a way of doing that, microdata is one possibility. I think there are some other possibilities, even using more aggregate data. So maybe throwing some machine learning at it, that sort of thing, that can potentially help us figure that out. So I think that's very high impact research for people to do. Then the second point that I wanted to touch on is the link to practitioners. And I noticed that we've already had a practitioner in the comments sort of reach out and say, hey, I'd be glad to talk to you guys about this. So I've made note of that, and I'll be reaching out to that person over LinkedIn to try and continue the discussion. But I think that really is crucial, because one of the things, again, that we want to do at the forum is bridge the gap between research and implementation, practice. And I think something, you touched on this, and I just wanted to stress it again. I think one thing that we don't see enough of at a sort of practice level is rigorous impact evaluation. There are some very nice examples of trade facilitation projects of different sorts that have been evaluated in a very rigorous way, so that you can really learn, how much bang did we get for our buck in that project. But I think you're absolutely right that bringing together these two communities to figure out ways in which, practitioners can go off and do their stuff. Nobody wants to hold them back and say, well, no, you're not allowed to do it unless you can do it as a randomized controlled trial. But at the same time, how can we try and build in evaluation at an early stage to try and broaden and deepen the information base that is available for elsewhere. So again, thank you so much for all of those comments. And let me take maybe a couple of questions from the audience through the Q&A and chat function. So the first question was a bit of a technical one, but I think it's important. We all know that these multi-region input-output tables are what make a lot of things work at the moment. So if you want to talk about a rigorous decomposition of GVC trade, you have to use a multi-region input-output table. If you're doing trade policy modeling in a general equilibrium framework, you pretty much have to use either a standard multi-region input-output table or the GTAP equivalent. And so a real issue with that is the lag with which it's produced and the amount of estimated data that goes into the table, because countries don't produce their tables in the same way. So I've used the ADB version of the multi-region input-output table. There are competing products out there. I really like the ADB version because they put it through a lot of consistency checks that not all of the other tables go through. So I really respect that. I think it is very high quality data. Of course, some of it is estimated and imputed. That's unavoidable. But the other reason that I like it is that they do it all very, very quickly. So there's typically only a 1 year to 18-month lag for the data to come out. So when I was writing this paper in 2020, I was using 2019 data. So if I were to write it now, I'd be using data through to 2021. So for people doing this sort of work, it really is an excellent resource because it's a lot more up to date than many of the other sources. Another question that I had was about some of the sectoral results. So particularly finding that in food and agriculture, there was a fairly low result. I mean, that the model was not doing a great job of sort of explaining changes in GVC trade. I'm honestly not sure of exactly why that is. The broad answer is that it's something to do with the way in which production sharing works in that sector. My suspicion is that in resource-intensive sectors, the types of decisions that businesses are making are perhaps a little different from the ones that I was picking up in my flowcharts, that they're thinking about things a little bit differently and therefore come out as being less sensitive to these sorts of changes in the context of the model. Generally, the parameters that I use for the model, which come from a secondary source, suggest that trade in food and agriculture is less sensitive to changes in trade costs than other sectors. So, that's the mathematical reason for the result. Substantively, I think we need to know a lot more about some of the sectoral characteristics before we can really answer that. Another question that I had a little bit in the same vein is about this result that trade facilitation matters more for trade in final goods than intermediates. So like I said at the time, that really surprised me. I expected exactly the opposite to be true. And I think it would be fair to say that most people in the area probably expected the exact opposite to be true. I'm still trying to figure out why it worked like that. Is it a quirk of the data and the way in which the data are collected and produced? Or is it something substantive about the types of trade facilitation measures that are captured in the TFIs? I have a suspicion that it's got a little bit to do with this second point. And it comes back to the comment that Maria made about heterogeneity. So the way in which even something like the TFA works is very different if you're moving a container of electronics goods or if you're moving a container of food. The rules that you're dealing with, the procedures that you're dealing with are always going to be different. And so I'm wondering if what I'm picking up in the TFIs is not doing full justice to some of the differences between final and intermediate trade, thinking of that sort of similar kind of heterogeneity to what Maria mentioned.
And can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah, go.
The ADB data, what countries is that available for, and what countries are you using?
So I used every country in the data set. It covers, I think, 63 countries. So it's basically, it's built on the World Input-Output database. So the core of it is the European countries plus North America. And then the guys at ADB extend it to actually a pretty large number of Asian countries. So even some of the smaller, something I'll advertise for them is that they get data even on some of the smaller Asian countries, which is, of course, very, very challenging because the data are often incomplete and not of the same quality as you see for a high-income country. So, yeah, I think it's a really nice data set. Obviously, when we do this work, it's very dependent on which countries we want to look at, as to which source we use.
And is it available free of charge to everyone who's on here?
Yep. So anyone can go, if you Google ADB multi-region input-output table, it'll get you to a WordPress site where they've got all this set up. You then just need to send them an email saying, I'm a researcher, I'd love to have access to your data. They'll think about it, and if you're a researcher in good faith, they will very likely give you access to it. So it is a number of these sources are freely available. So the OECD WTO trade and value added database, which has an input-output table as its core, that's also freely available. The World Input-Output database is also freely available. So there's a number of good sources out there that you don't need to pay for.
That's excellent. And your presentation will be up on the website, as will Maria's. And how about reference lists?
Yeah, so
important references.
Yeah, I saw someone asked for a link to the paper. So what I'll do, everyone gets a message from Zoom 24 hours after the webinar finishes. So in that message, I'll include a link to an ungated version of the paper. So I can send you the link to the journal. That's not much use for people who aren't in universities. But I'll send you a link to the ungated version of the paper so everyone can have a look at that. There's just one last question that I wanted to kind of answer, because I think it ties into something that Maria said, but also makes an important additional point. And that's the question of what my trade facilitation indicator variable is actually measuring. It's implementation on the ground. So OECD goes and consults with governments and experts to see whether or not particular systems that are in the TFA in fact exist in those countries. So they'll go and check, for example, do you publish your tariff rates online in an international language, meaning one of the WTO languages? Do you have an electronic single window? Do you have an authorized economic operator scheme? All of these sorts of things. And they tally all of that up and they sum it and they produce the index. So it is getting actual implementation on the ground. It's not sort of, it's not sort of legal commitments that people have taken on in the TFA. Now, having said that, we were talking earlier about heterogeneity among these measures. So one thing that my paper can't answer is, if you're a low-income country and you're relatively early on in your trade facilitation career, what should you start with? Which one of these measures should you implement first? So my paper doesn't answer that. I would love to see a paper that answers that question. So to take environments and find out for different levels of pre-existing implementation, what makes the most difference. And I think that, Maria described that as sort of one of the key areas to be thinking about. And I would absolutely agree with that. And again, I'm seeing notes from practitioners in the chat that I think are very helpful, and we'll link up with them, I think, to try and get some of that information. But look, thank you firstly to Maria for the great and extremely constructive comments, and also for everyone here for all the questions and comments in chat and Q&A. Hopefully I got through most of them. If I didn't, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or send me an email. I'll be happy to continue the discussion.
Excellent. Before we go, I'm going to let Maria, if there are any closing thoughts.
No, I've just loved listening to Ben's description here and to read the comments. Very educational.
Yes, we have an amazing community that we're so happy that we get to interact with. And I see more practitioners such as Audrey came in and other data analysts like Eugen also. So really good to see everybody, really good to see that everyone is so excited and engaged. And please jump on, if you're not already in the LinkedIn group, make sure that you get on there and read Ben's email that he will be sending out. Tell us if you intend to run with these ideas. If you have, something coming up, a PhD thesis or something, right? So that we can we can get in on that and stay in contact. So we're sort of closing this off, but Ben, you already know what we're going to do next month.
I do. Let me just bring that up. So we have Maggie Chen next month. Yes. So Maggie is a professor at George Washington University. And when Maria and I were talking, we said, well, of course, you can't always do a randomized controlled trial to figure out the answer to your trade facilitation question. And Maggie's come along and she's actually managed to do a randomized controlled trial, not on trade facilitation, but on changing people's minds about trade policy. I think for anyone who's worked in trade policy, we all know that the hardest part of it is getting people to agree on what the objectives are and what the evidence says. And so Maggie and her co-authors have done this really great experiment. I'm not going to give any spoilers about the results, but if you're involved in the policy process, I think this is a great one for you. And we have Lucien Chernat, who of course is a practitioner who's spent his career trying to change people's minds about trade policy. And I'm looking forward to a really great discussion between them.
All right, and I also would just like to summarize, Ben, I told everybody who thought it was good to have you on as a speaker to let us know. And I think, the evidence is overwhelming there. So I think you're gonna have to come back at some point. Same goes for Maria. So connect with us everywhere, keep us posted on what you guys are doing, what you're interested in learning more about. This is a collaborative effort. And so if you have topics or speakers that you would like to have on here, let us know and we'll do our very best to get that on. So that's it for today, right?
That's it. Thanks to everyone for attending.
Thank you, Maria. Yes, and thank you everyone for all your questions and comments.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.